Hi folks, welcome to the first episode of Governance this week in 2024. We're talking crises, how the EU handles them, as well as the economic and geopolitical risks in the year ahead. With us in the studio is Professor Georgios Papakonstantinou, who is the Acting Director at the Florence School of Transnational Governance, but he also was the Greek Finance Minister in 2009 at the height of the Euro crisis. Welcome, George. You know a thing or two about dealing with crises, so let's start there. What does the EU actually learn from the multiple crises it has to deal with?
So if we want to be a bit cheeky, we would say, does the EU ever learn? In fact, it does. Every crisis brings up new problems, of course, but also new solutions. Take the Eurozone crisis. Mistakes in the construction of the euro came back to haunt us, and we created new mechanisms, new policy tools to be able to deal with it. We realized that political time is different from market time, so we learned how to deal better with markets. And we also realized, for example, that excessive austerity was not the solution. So we learned in this process that we adapt our institutions. Then came COVID. We realized that you did need to have a European response in a public policy such as health, which was not really in the European agenda until that time. We also realized that we needed new economic policy instruments, so we came out with the Next Generation EU, for example. We adapted the use of things like the Stability and Growth Pact. So again, we learned and we adapted our instruments. Then came Ukraine and energy, which was, of course, an important policy issue on the agenda, became central. We realized that excessive reliance and perhaps some naive view of how integrating Russia into the West through trade was not going to give us the result that we wanted, made us rethink our energy dependence, reduce our dependence on Russia, and accelerate the transition to renewables. So every single crisis necessarily concentrates the mind, forces European policy leaders to adapt institutions, adapt instruments, create new policy tools. There is, of course, a famous phrase that is Europe learns through crisis and is forged through crisis. And I think it's very true. Now, this does not mean that we always, sometimes we'll forget some of the lessons. We'll learn new ones and we'll forget some of the old ones. It is a learning process, and I think the trick with good policy making is to get those lessons embedded in new policies as we move forward, so that it is not something that we forgot. For example, there's now the danger, did we forget some of the lessons from COVID in terms of the importance of public health policy, for example? It is important to keep pushing forward in that sense.
Yeah. And before we move forward to the next question, do you think that we here in Europe do a good job, and the EU institutions do a good job in actually learning those lessons and integrating them?
I think to an extent, yes. I think that when these are embedded into new policy instruments that become part of the apparatus, I think that's the best. When they also break down taboos, old taboos, like Next Generation EU broke down taboos about central borrowing from the EU. But sometimes, it is true, we're only half successful. We create something new forced by events, and then when the events are past, we tend to forget it and move back to status quo ante, which is, of course, not ideal.
Yeah. Of course, a new year is also new geopolitical and economic risks and opportunities. Let's have a look at those.
Okay, I'm going to give you five, sort of five of the more narrow, let's say, EU risks for the EU as we go forward. And I would say the first one is our economy. So we are in danger of what economists call a secular stagnation. In other words, a combination of low growth but also low inflation. So at the moment we're seeing inflation abate somewhat. The European Central Bank is trying to decide how exactly to deal with that, but growth is not really picking up as much as it should in a number of countries. The biggest country, Germany, is clearly not seen as pulling its weight as it has in the past. So that's the first big risk. The second one, I would say, connected to the first perhaps, is continuing pressures on budgets and debts. We are now in a situation where the public debt as a percentage of GDP in the EU as a whole is about 10 percentage points higher than it was in 2009 when the crisis happened. Okay, it's different circumstances, so we're not in danger as we were, but there are short-term pressures and longer-term pressures. We'll come to some of those around the climate transition, for example, that will keep putting pressure on those budgets. So that is a second concern. I would say a third one has to do with financial stability. At the moment, things are quiet, but we saw in 2023, we saw last year in the US, for example, some bank failures. In parts of Europe, not in the EU, some failings of banks as well. We have not had problems in the EU, at least not significant ones, but as banking is being transformed through digital, as shadow banking becomes more important, as we have non-banking entities doing banking, this is an issue, a risk that needs to be taken on board. Then I would say the fourth is the increasingly difficult geopolitics. I don't think I need to motivate this very much. We are in a very unstable world. The Ukraine conflict continues and risks to be a frozen conflict for a long time. We have the Middle East conflict. So that disrupts economies and creates further fragmentation in the world economy. We can come back to that in a moment. And my final big risk that I would say comes from the other part of the Atlantic. There are elections next November in the US, and at the time, as we speak, it is possible that we will have Donald Trump coming back as president. This will completely change the geopolitical and economic environment within which Europe operates. We will have to rely much more on ourselves. Some of the multilateral rules that keep us going will no longer be there. There is a big question what will happen to American democracy, with a lot of implication also for populist movements in Europe. So these would be 5 of the immediate risks I would come up with.
Yeah. Before we move to the broader challenges, you're of course an economist. You've served in government as a finance minister. You've been through all this before. How worried are you at the moment for the European economy, kind of in light of what you've just been sharing?
Look, the European economy is at the moment growing. It is not growing as much as we would like it to do. It is being held back by issues that have to do with inflation. It is being held back by the uncertainty around the geopolitics. We're far from realizing our growth potential as a continent. We're far from having kind of gotten over the disparities in our growth rates and the rather convergence, the divergence between EU member states. So I would say that following COVID, we were hoping for a quick uptake and a transformation at the same time. We've seen this only to a certain extent, but not as much as we'd hoped.
Yeah. Very clear. Indeed, you've touched upon one of them already previously. There are also some broader long-term challenges that Europe needs to deal with. What are those?
Okay, I mean, I think that the obvious one that we need to start with is the climate transition. We're seeing the temperature peaks every year. The willingness in theory is there. The framework for working towards climate neutrality is there. Are we doing enough in that respect? It's a very mixed picture. Clearly, the kind of actions that we're taking fall short of what is necessary to stay within climate targets and limiting the increase in temperature. Clearly so. There's also good news. The good news is that industry and the private sector have pivoted towards renewables. It is clearly now a profit opportunity. There's a race to be first. Europe is taking part of this in this, and there are Greek and European firms across the spectrum of industries are moving in that, from renewal of housing to transport to new materials. So we do see a certain movement in that direction. Also good news is the fact that that China continues to be on board. There's a lot of work to be done there. They still have not dealt with, they're still expanding their non-renewables production, but there is a shift happening, and if we don't see it in China, then we're doomed overall. So I would say climate continues to be the biggest long-term challenge, where Europe is a small part of the picture in terms of its own efforts, which need to be done, but where it has a big role to play in terms of financing transition, helping to finance transition for other parts of the world who did not reap the benefits, let's say, of being able to forget about climate until now. And we need to help finance that transition in developing countries, but also continue to be a leader in terms of being first in terms of its ability, the speed with which it makes a transition, and the change in behaviors, the change in consumption patterns, the move to the circular economy, and a regulator around these things.
Mm-hmm. So we're looking at a Europe which hopefully will stay a climate leader.
I would hope so. I would like us to think so. And we're not always all speaking with one voice there. So I would say that this is the first and by far the most important longer term challenge. The second one is everything around digital. And we are increasingly, of course, speaking of AI, which has burst into the scene in 2023 in many ways. The potential productivity benefits of AI, but also the dangers from displacement of jobs and tasks to, of course, dangers around disinformation, democracy, and the like. So this is an area in which the EU is trying to, again, stay at the frontier through its regulatory power. The recent AI Act, for example, is one. But where we're good as regulators, but we're not very good as producers. We're not very good as being on the frontier of the innovation and companies that can take advantage of these new technologies and transform the European economy. So I would say that's the second long-term challenge. Then I would move to a different type of challenge, which is the trend that we see within our countries to rising inequalities. Across all EU countries, we see mounting discontent, which is associated with rising inequalities and feelings of not participating, not being in societies where people get a fair share of growth and its spoils, so to speak. So that feeds into populist sentiment. This political discontent is something that we cannot take lightly. We have European elections coming up. This will be probably registered very strongly in the European elections. And if you link this to a possible Trump win in the US, this creates a quite dystopian future for the EU, and one that we need to worry about, not just for next year, but in a broader sense. Fourth, I would say the aging society and demographics. Demographics is destiny, and the EU is an aging continent, which should make us open up a whole conversation around migration, how we're able to welcome a controlled migration and integrate it into our societies, because that will be part of dealing with immigration, with the demographics problem that we're going to be facing. And finally, I would say the question of deglobalization or fragmentation of the world economy. We are in a world where we've gone beyond having different blocks to fragmentation. This has become very clear with the Ukraine conflict. And this fragmentation, you can see it in the financial systems, you can see it, of course, in trade, and it can have spillovers onto other areas such as climate, health, and the like. And that's very dangerous for the world economy. And this is something where the EU could have a leadership position, because it is a champion of multilateral rules. It is a champion of governance rules of the game that have a net positive effect for everyone, that they are win-win for the whole globe. And with the US kind of sitting on the fence on this and having a more transactional approach, which could be even taking us back if we have a second Trump presidency, it is extremely important for the EU to stay on track there. Yeah. So these would be my 5 sort of most significant longer-term challenges. And
there are quite a few of them. We're going to watch them. And in fact, just to mention this to the viewers, one of the upcoming episodes is with Professor Tommaso Nannicini on populism in Europe. So stay tuned for that. What is Europe going to do in 24 to deal with the crises and the challenges and opportunities it faces?
So, starting from the narrower to the, let's start from a narrow view and then broaden the view a little bit. And the narrow view is, can we fix our economic governance issues? So there's been this long discussion and some compromises around the Stability and Growth Pact, for example. There's a lot of discussion about completing the capital markets union. To anyone sort of not being every day in the discussion, these seem as irrelevant or overly technical. But at the end of the day, they're important because they tell governments how much they can spend. They allow us to leverage private capital to be able to pursue European public goods, for example, that are good for the whole, for every European. Are we going to have new resources that will be able to help us fund the climate transition and the digital revolution? So there's a set of things around the narrow economics where there are some steps being made. We already have new regulations and new agreements. They're in the right direction, but again, fall short of what is required. Capital markets, we should have done it long time ago. It is the fact that we have not completed it is a big problem, just to give an example. Second then, if we broaden the lens a little bit, Europe has, and the European Union has benefited from one of our biggest achievements, which is the single market. The single market, we need to think ahead. What kind of future do we want from a single market? How is that going to underpin European competitiveness in an increasingly fragmented world and one where global powers will be competing for space, for resources? And there's a whole reflection going on within the EU. There's 2 reports that have been commissioned to help the next commission to sort of frame priorities. This is the Letta report on the single market and the report on competitiveness by Mario Draghi. I am hoping that, and we had the pleasure of hosting here in December at the Florence Scholtalbers National Governance, Enrico Letta, to speak about that. I'm hoping that these reports generate a discussion about how the single market should be, how European competitiveness can be rekindled, because in the last 20 years, rather than converging with the US, we have diverged in terms of competitiveness. So this is a second group of things that I think we are doing, and I want us to continue doing. And the third is issues around our connection to the rest of the world. Increasingly, when we talk about European reform, we are talking about how Europe changes its relation to the rest of the world. There is a whole discussion around EU enlargement, for example, in the Balkans, but going further, of course, Ukraine and the like. So their decisions, some of which have been taken, some of which have only been taken, need to be courageous, because Europe needs critical mass. It needs to be able to keep expanding and integrating new countries. I realize that this is not an easy process. We are thinking of gradual integration, for example, as opposed to a purely black or white situation, you're in, you're out, to be able, for these countries to be able to gradually become part of the European family. So that will allow us to have a voice and a stature that will help us in this fragmenting world order, to be able to ascertain our position and fight for relevance in what is a shrinking continent in terms of the number of people and in terms of its weight in GDP and in trade with the rest of the world. And there's a host of issues around the role of the euro, for example, to how we do this sort of de-risking exercise, sourcing raw materials which are important for the new digital industries. These are the policy areas in which the new European institutions and the new Commission that will be formed after the summer, the new European Parliament that will be elected in the summer, will be called upon to act. And I am hoping that the European Parliament elections will deliver the kind of result where the different institutions are going to be working together and advance in all these areas.
Yeah. Well, George, I think you've really kind of painted a picture of all of the things that the EU is going to be dealing with in 2024. So we're looking forward in this first episode to an interesting and certainly to some extent difficult year ahead. And many of the issues, if not all, that you've touched upon, also part of the portfolio here at the Florence School of Transnational Governance, right? In masters, the studies for our masters students, the training for policy professionals, and the events, like you mentioned, the one with Enrico Letta. So a busy year ahead as well here at the School of Transnational Governance.
Very much so, and we hope that we will be able to contribute to this conversation through our teaching, through our training, and through hosting here a number of fellows that pursue projects that speak to all these issues that I've outlined.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, George.
My pleasure.